The silence stretched between them like a bridge. Neither was ready to cross. Aaron Collins sitting on one end of the worn leather couch, while Kenneth Wright remained frozen in the doorway of their shared apartment. The weight of what Kenneth had just confessed hung in the air, electric and terrifying, transforming their familiar living room into something entirely foreign. Aaron's heart hammered against his ribs as he processed the words that had just shattered everything he thought he knew about his straight roommate, about their friendship, about the careful walls he had built around his own feelings over the past 8 months of living together. Kenneth's voice had been barely above a whisper when he said it. Those words that Aaron had dreamed of hearing, but never believed possible. The confession lingered between them now, vulnerable and raw, waiting for Aaron's response. But Aaron found himself paralyzed, caught between the desperate hope that had lived quietly in his chest for months, and the terror that this moment might somehow disappear if he moved too quickly, spoke too soon, breathed too hard. The golden afternoon light streaming through their apartment windows caught the uncertainty in Kenneth's dark eyes, and Aaron could see the way his roommate's hands trembled slightly at his sides. This was Kenneth Wright, who commanded every room he entered, who dated a string of beautiful women with effortless charm, who had never once given Aaron any indication that he might be interested in men, let alone in his quiet, bookish roommate, who spent most evenings grading papers and trying not to stare too obviously when Kenneth emerged from the shower with damp hair and sleep-warm skin. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, with Kenneth's confession hanging between them like a question mark written in the air, Aaron needed to remember how it all began. How a simple invitation to share a meal had opened a door that neither of them could close, leading them down a path that would change everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. 3 months earlier, Aaron had been hunched over his laptop at the small kitchen table, red pen poised over another stack of freshman composition essays, when Kenneth had appeared in the doorway between their kitchen and living room. It was a Thursday evening in late September, the kind of crisp autumn night that made Aaron grateful for their cozy apartment with its warm lighting and the lingering scent of the coffee he had been nursing for the past 2 hours. Kenneth had been fidgeting with his phone, an unusual display of nervousness for someone who typically moved through the world with such easy confidence. Aaron had glanced up from the essay he was grading, noting the way Kenneth's dark hair fell across his forehead and how he seemed to be working up the courage to say something. They had been roommates for 5 months at that point, ever since Aaron had answered Kenneth's Craigslist ad for someone to split the rent on a 2-bedroom apartment near the university where Aaron taught English composition. Their arrangement had been purely practical from the start. Kenneth worked in marketing for a tech startup downtown, kept regular hours, paid his bills on time, and seemed like the kind of reliable roommate who would not leave dirty dishes in the sink or bring home random strangers at all hours. Aaron had been grateful to find someone so seemingly uncomplicated, someone who would allow him to maintain the quiet, orderly life he preferred. What Aaron had not anticipated was how Kenneth's presence would gradually seep into every corner of his carefully constructed routine. The way Kenneth hummed unconsciously while making his morning coffee, how he always asked if Aaron needed anything when he went to the grocery store, the casual warmth of his smile when they passed each other in the hallway. Small things that should not have mattered, but somehow did, accumulating like morning frost until Aaron found himself looking forward to these brief interactions in ways that felt both precious and dangerous. Kenneth had been dating someone then, a marketing executive named Jennifer, who wore expensive perfume and laughed too loudly at Kenneth's jokes. Aaron had met her exactly 3 times, each encounter leaving him with a strange, hollow feeling that he refused to examine too closely. She was beautiful in an obvious way, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a wardrobe that probably cost more than Aaron made in a month. She was also, Aaron had to admit, exactly the type of woman Kenneth always seemed to date: confident, successful, conventionally attractive women who looked like they belonged on his arm at company parties and weekend getaways. So when Kenneth had finally spoken that Thursday evening, clearing his throat and asking if Aaron wanted to grab dinner together, Aaron had assumed it was simply a friendly gesture between roommates. Nothing more complicated than 2 people who happened to live in the same space deciding to share a meal instead of eating alone. Kenneth had suggested the small Italian place 3 blocks from their apartment, a family-owned restaurant with checkered tablecloths and candles stuck in wine bottles. The kind of place Aaron would never have chosen for himself, not because he disliked it, but because eating alone at such an obviously romantic establishment felt like highlighting his solitude in ways that made him uncomfortable. But with Kenneth across from him, gesturing animatedly as he told a story about his coworker's disastrous presentation that afternoon, the restaurant felt different, warm and intimate in a way that had nothing to do with the dim lighting or the couple at the next table sharing dessert. Kenneth had ordered wine for both of them without asking, seeming to sense that Aaron needed something to relax the tension he carried in his shoulders after long days of teaching. The conversation had flowed easier than Aaron had expected. They talked about Kenneth's work, about Aaron's students, about the books Aaron was always reading, and the hiking trails Kenneth explored on weekends. Simple topics that somehow felt weighted with significance, as if they were mapping the territories of each other's lives for the first time. It was during dessert that Kenneth had grown quiet, twirling his fork through the tiramisu they were sharing, while his expression became thoughtful in a way Aaron had never seen before. Kenneth had always been someone who filled silences with easy chatter, but this quiet felt different, contemplative rather than uncomfortable. Aaron had been about to ask if everything was okay when Kenneth had looked up, meeting his eyes with an intensity that made Aaron's breath catch. For a moment, something had flickered between them, electric and unnamed, before Kenneth had smiled and asked if Aaron wanted to split the check. They had walked home in comfortable silence, the wine making Aaron feel loose-limbed and more relaxed than he had been in months. Kenneth had lingered outside Aaron's bedroom door when they reached their apartment, seeming reluctant to end the evening, before finally saying goodnight and disappearing into his own room. Aaron had lain awake for hours that night, replaying every moment of the dinner, trying to understand why a simple meal between roommates had felt like something else entirely, something that made his chest tight with possibility and his mind race with questions he was afraid to answer. The dinner had become a weekly tradition after that, though neither of them had explicitly discussed it. Every Thursday, Kenneth would appear in the kitchen doorway while Aaron was grading papers, and they would walk to the Italian restaurant or try somewhere new in their neighborhood. Sometimes they talked about work or current events, but increasingly their conversations drifted toward more personal territory. Kenneth told Aaron about growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, about the pressure he had felt to follow a predetermined path that never quite felt like his own. Aaron shared stories about his graduate school years, about the loneliness of academic life, and the satisfaction he found in helping his students discover their own voices through writing. These dinners had a quality that Aaron struggled to define. They felt like dates in every way that mattered, from the way Kenneth always insisted on paying to the lingering walks home afterward, but Aaron forced himself to view them as friendship. Kenneth was straight, had a girlfriend, showed no signs of being interested in men. Aaron had learned to be careful with his hope, to keep his feelings contained in the safe space of his own imagination, where they could not complicate the easy companionship he and Kenneth had developed. But Kenneth had broken up with Jennifer in early November, appearing in the kitchen one Thursday evening with red-rimmed eyes and a bottle of expensive whiskey. Aaron had abandoned his grading immediately, settling beside Kenneth on their couch, while Kenneth explained how Jennifer had accused him of being emotionally unavailable, of holding parts of himself back even after 8 months of dating. She was not wrong, Kenneth had admitted, staring into his whiskey glass as if it might contain answers. He had been holding back, but not in the way Jennifer assumed. It was more that he felt like he was playing a role that did not quite fit, going through the motions of a relationship without ever feeling fully present or engaged. Aaron had listened without offering advice, sensing that Kenneth needed space to work through his thoughts rather than solutions. But as the evening wore on and the whiskey loosened Kenneth's usual careful control, Aaron had found himself studying his roommate's profile in the lamplight, noting the vulnerability in his expression and the way his voice grew softer when he talked about feeling lost. That night, Kenneth had fallen asleep on the couch, his head pillowed on Aaron's shoulder in a gesture of trust that made Aaron's heart race even as he forced himself to remain still. Aaron had covered Kenneth with a blanket and spent the rest of the night in his own bed, staring at the ceiling and trying not to read too much into the weight of Kenneth's head against his shoulder or the way Kenneth had unconsciously moved closer in his sleep. Their Thursday dinners, honors had continued, but something had shifted after Kenneth's breakup. The conversations grew deeper, more intimate, touching on topics they had never explored before. Kenneth talked about feeling like he was drifting through life without a clear sense of direction or purpose. Aaron shared his own struggles with loneliness and the difficulty of connecting with people in meaningful ways. There were moments during these conversations when Aaron caught Kenneth looking at him with an expression he could not quite interpret, something thoughtful and searching, as if Kenneth was seeing him clearly for the first time. These looks made Aaron's pulse quicken, but he forced himself not to hope, not to imagine that the growing closeness between them meant anything more than friendship. December had brought the first real snow of the winter, blanketing their neighborhood in pristine white that transformed familiar streets into something magical. Aaron had been reading on the couch one Sunday afternoon when Kenneth had burst through the front door with cheeks flushed from cold and snowflakes caught in his dark hair. Kenneth had been out for one of his long walks, something he did when he needed to think. But instead of disappearing into his room as he usually did, he had settled on the opposite end of the couch from Aaron. They had sat in comfortable silence for a while, Aaron reading while Kenneth stared out the window at the falling snow until Kenneth had spoken suddenly. He had been thinking about what Jennifer had said about him being emotionally unavailable, Kenneth had told Aaron, about how he had never felt fully present in any of his relationships, always holding something back without understanding what or why. He had dated plenty of women over the years, had even imagined himself in love a few times, but there had always been something missing. Some essential connection that he could not name but always felt the absence of. Aaron had set his book aside, giving Kenneth his full attention as his roommate struggled to articulate feelings that seemed to surprise him with their complexity. Kenneth had been staring at his hands as he spoke, his voice quiet and uncertain in a way that was so different from his usual confidence that Aaron felt something shift in his chest. Kenneth had looked up then, meeting Aaron's eyes with an expression of such raw vulnerability that Aaron had to resist the urge to reach out and touch him. There was something Kenneth was trying to say, Aaron realized, something that went beyond simple post-breakup reflection. But whatever it was remained unspoken, hanging in the air between them like a question neither was ready to ask. The shift had been gradual at first, so subtle that Aaron had almost convinced himself he was imagining it. Kenneth began staying home more often on weekends instead of going out with his coworkers. He started joining Aaron for his quiet Sunday morning routine of coffee and newspaper, settling at the kitchen table with his own mug while Aaron worked through the crossword puzzle. These domestic moments felt precious to Aaron in ways that probably showed on his face, though Kenneth never commented on the way Aaron's expression softened when he looked up to find Kenneth reading over his shoulder or offering suggestions for particularly challenging clues. Their Thursday dinners on spa had evolved too, becoming longer affairs that stretched well into the evening. They had exhausted most of the restaurants in their immediate neighborhood and had begun venturing further afield, taking the subway to different parts of the city to try cuisines they had never experienced before. Kenneth had developed an adventurous streak when it came to food, always wanting to order the most unusual item on the menu, and Aaron found himself charmed by this playful side of his roommate that he had never seen before. It was during one of these dinners at a small Ethiopian restaurant in Brooklyn that Kenneth had asked Aaron about his dating life. The question had come out of nowhere, interrupting Aaron's story about a particularly challenging student, and Aaron had nearly choked on his injera bread. Aaron rarely talked about dating, partly because there was not much to discuss, and partly because the topic felt too dangerous given his growing feelings for Kenneth. He had been on a few dates since moving to the city, awkward encounters arranged through dating apps that had left him feeling more lonely than before. None of the men he had met had sparked any real interest, though Aaron had not examined too closely whether this was because of their individual shortcomings or because he was too distracted by his impossible feelings for his straight roommate. Kenneth had persisted when Aaron tried to deflect the question, genuine curiosity in his voice, as he asked why someone as intelligent and kind as Aaron was single. The compliment had made Aaron's cheeks warm, though he had tried to hide his reaction behind his water glass. Aaron had given some vague answer about being focused on his career and not having met the right person yet, but Kenneth had not seemed satisfied with this explanation. He had pressed gently, asking about Aaron's past relationships, about what he was looking for in a partner, about whether he ever felt lonely living the quiet life he had chosen. The questions had felt loaded with meaning that Aaron was afraid to interpret. Kenneth's attention was focused entirely on him, dark eyes intent and searching, as if Aaron's answers mattered in some way that went beyond casual curiosity. Aaron had found himself being more honest than he had intended, talking about the difficulty of finding genuine connection and the way most of his dates had felt like performances rather than authentic encounters. Kenneth had nodded as if he understood exactly what Aaron meant. And when Aaron had turned the question back to him, asking about Kenneth's own dating experiences, his roommate had grown thoughtful in that way that was becoming increasingly familiar. Kenneth had talked about always feeling like he was trying to fit himself into expectations that did not quite match who he was inside, about going through the motions of romance without ever feeling the spark that everyone talked about. He had dated beautiful, successful women who looked perfect on paper, but something essential had always been missing. Some quality of recognition or understanding that he had begun to think might not exist, at least not for him. As Kenneth spoke, Aaron had found himself studying his roommate's face in the flickering candlelight, noting the way Kenneth's expression grew wistful when he talked about searching for something he could not name. There had been moments during that conversation when Aaron had felt like Kenneth was trying to tell him something specific, something that went beyond general dissatisfaction with his romantic life. The walk home had been quiet, both of them lost in thought as they navigated the familiar streets of their neighborhood. When they reached their apartment building, Kenneth had lingered on the front steps, seeming reluctant to go inside and end the evening. Aaron had been fumbling for his keys when Kenneth had spoken, his voice soft in the winter air. He had thanked Aaron for listening, for being the kind of person he could talk to about things he had never discussed with anyone else. There had been something in Kenneth's tone that made Aaron look up, meeting his roommate's eyes in the glow of the streetlight. For a moment, they had simply stood there, looking at each other, and Aaron had felt that electric tension that seemed to appear more and more frequently between them. Kenneth had taken a half step closer, close enough that Aaron could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that Aaron had to resist the urge to reach out and brush the snow from Kenneth's hair. Then Kenneth had smiled, that warm expression that never failed to make Aaron's heart skip, and had headed inside, leaving Aaron standing on the steps wondering if he had imagined the charged moment between them. January had brought a cold snap that seemed to settle permanently over the city, the kind of bitter weather that made leaving the apartment feel like a monumental effort. Aaron had been grateful for the excuse to stay home more often, to curl up with books and hot tea while the wind rattled their windows. Kenneth had seemed equally content to abandon his usual weekend activities, spending more time in their shared living space instead of going out with friends or colleagues. It was during one of these quiet weekends that their dynamic had shifted again, in ways that Aaron had not seen coming, but that felt inevitable in retrospect. Kenneth had been restless all day of Saturday, pacing around the apartment and starting conversations that he seemed unable to finish. Aaron had been reading on the couch, trying to give Kenneth space to work through whatever was bothering him, when Kenneth had finally settled at the opposite end of the couch with a heavy sigh. Kenneth had been thinking about their conversation at the Ethiopian restaurant, he had told Aaron, about what Aaron had said about most dates feeling like performances rather than authentic connections. The comment had stayed with Kenneth, apparently, because it had perfectly captured something he had been struggling to articulate about his own romantic experiences. Aaron had set his book aside, recognizing that this was one of those conversations that required his full attention. Kenneth had been staring at his hands as he spoke, his voice uncertain in a way that made Aaron want to reach out and offer comfort. Kenneth had never felt like himself on dates, he had explained. Always felt like he was playing a role that someone else had written for him, saying the things he thought he was supposed to say, and behaving in ways that felt foreign to his nature. Even with women he genuinely liked, there had been a quality of distance, as if he was watching himself go through the motions of romance from outside his own body. Aaron had listened without interrupting, though his heart had begun to race as Kenneth spoke. There was something different about this conversation. Something more vulnerable and searching than their previous discussions about relationships. Kenneth kept glancing at Aaron as if gauging his reaction, as if Aaron's response to these confessions mattered in ways that went beyond friendship. Kenneth had paused then, seeming to gather courage before continuing. He had been wondering lately if the problem was not with the women he had dated, but with something fundamental about himself. Something he had never allowed himself to examine too closely because it challenged assumptions he had always taken for granted. The silence that followed had felt heavy with implication. Aaron had found himself holding his breath, afraid to move or speak for fear of disrupting whatever Kenneth was working toward. His roommate had been staring at the coffee table between them, his jaw tight with tension. And Aaron had realized that Kenneth was struggling with something that went far deeper than simple romantic dissatisfaction. When Kenneth had finally looked up, meeting Aaron's eyes directly, Aaron had seen something raw and frightened in his expression. Kenneth had opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shaking his head with a frustrated laugh. Aaron had found his voice then, asking gently if Kenneth wanted to talk about whatever was bothering him. The offer had seemed to break something loose in Kenneth, and he had launched into a halting explanation of thoughts and feelings he was clearly struggling to understand himself. Kenneth had been having dreams lately, he had told Aaron. Dreams that left him confused and unsettled when he woke up. Dreams about people he should not be dreaming about in ways that challenged everything he thought he knew about himself. He had been trying to dismiss these dreams as meaningless, but they had been becoming more frequent and more vivid, impossible to ignore. Aaron's pulse had quickened as he listened, though he had forced himself to remain still and attentive. Kenneth had been speaking carefully, choosing his words with obvious deliberation, but Aaron could hear the fear beneath his careful control, the fear of someone confronting possibilities that could change everything about how he understood himself. Kenneth had stopped talking then, looking at Aaron with an expression that seemed to be asking for something. Permission maybe, or understanding, or simply the assurance that Aaron would not judge him for the thoughts he was struggling to voice. Aaron had leaned forward slightly, closing some of the distance between them on the couch, and had told Kenneth that he could talk to him about anything. That whatever Kenneth was thinking or feeling, Aaron would listen without judgment. The simple offer of acceptance had seemed to unlock something in Kenneth. He had begun talking more freely then, describing the confusion of waking up from dreams that felt more real and meaningful than any of his actual romantic experiences. Dreams that left him questioning assumptions about himself that he had never thought to examine. The conversation had continued late into the night, Kenneth's initial hesitation giving way to a flood of thoughts and feelings he had clearly been holding back for months. Aaron had listened with a mixture of hope and terror as Kenneth described the growing dissatisfaction he felt with his life, the sense that he had been following a script written by someone else without ever stopping to consider whether it matched his own desires. Kenneth had talked about watching Aaron move through the world with such quiet confidence, such certainty about who he was and what he wanted. There was something about Aaron's authenticity that Kenneth envied, he had admitted, a quality of being fully present in his own life that Kenneth had never managed to achieve. Aaron had been struck by the irony of Kenneth's observation, given how much of Aaron's life had been spent hiding his true feelings and pretending to be satisfied with friendship when he wanted so much more. But he had not corrected Kenneth's perception, sensing that his roommate needed to work through his own thoughts without the complication of Aaron's feelings. As the evening had worn on, Kenneth had grown more specific about the dreams that had been troubling him. Dreams about intimacy and connection that felt different from anything he had experienced in his waking life. Dreams that left him feeling like he had glimpsed something essential about himself that he had been missing. Aaron had found himself leaning closer as Kenneth spoke, drawn by the vulnerability in his roommate's voice and the courage it must have taken to voice such private thoughts. There had been moments when Kenneth had seemed on the verge of saying something more direct, something that would cross the line from general confusion into specific attraction. But he had always pulled back at the last moment. The night had ended with Kenneth thanking Aaron for listening and disappearing into his bedroom, leaving Aaron alone on the couch with his heart racing and his mind spinning with possibilities he was afraid to fully consider. Kenneth had not said anything explicitly about being attracted to men, had not mentioned Aaron specifically in the context of his confusing dreams. But something in the way he had looked at Aaron throughout their conversation had felt loaded with meaning. Aaron had spent the rest of the weekend analyzing every word of their conversation, searching for clues about what Kenneth might be feeling, while trying not to let hope overwhelm his better judgment. Kenneth was clearly struggling with something significant, something that was challenging his understanding of himself in fundamental ways. But Aaron could not be certain that this struggle had anything to do with him personally. Their Thursday dinner that week had felt different, charged with an undercurrent of tension that had not been there before. Kenneth had seemed nervous, fidgeting with his napkin, and struggling to maintain his usual easy conversation. Aaron had found himself hyper-aware of every gesture, every glance, searching for signs of what Kenneth might be thinking or feeling. It was during dessert that Kenneth had asked the question that had made Aaron's heart stop. Kenneth had been staring into his coffee cup, his voice carefully casual as he asked Aaron what it had been like when he first realized he was gay. The question had hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them had been ready to address directly. Aaron had felt his cheeks warm as he considered how to respond, aware that his answer might influence whatever Kenneth was working through in his own mind. Aaron had chosen his words carefully, talking about the gradual recognition of something that had always been true about himself rather than a sudden revelation. He had described the relief of finally understanding why his relationships with women had never felt quite right, why he had always felt like he was performing rather than genuinely connecting. Kenneth had listened intently, nodding as if Aaron's experience resonated with his own thoughts and feelings. When Aaron had finished speaking, Kenneth had been quiet for a long moment before asking if Aaron had ever been afraid of what accepting that truth might mean for his life. Aaron had admitted that fear had been a significant part of his journey, the terror of disappointing family members or losing friendships, of having to rebuild his understanding of himself and his future. But he had also talked about the peace that had come with self-acceptance, the relief of no longer fighting against his own nature. Kenneth had absorbed this information with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle, and Aaron had realized that his roommate was not asking these questions out of idle curiosity. Kenneth was working through something specific, something personal, and Aaron's answers were helping him navigate his own confusion. The weeks following that conversation had been marked by a subtle but unmistakable shift in Kenneth's behavior. He had become more physically affectionate, finding excuses to touch Aaron's shoulder when he passed behind his chair, or letting their hands brush when they reached for the same thing. These touches had felt intentional rather than accidental, lasting just a moment longer than necessary, and leaving Aaron's skin tingling with awareness. Kenneth had also begun staying up later on the nights when Aaron was grading papers, settling on the couch with his laptop or a book instead of retreating to his bedroom as he usually did. Aaron had found these quiet evenings together both precious and torturous, hyper-aware of Kenneth's presence while trying to maintain focus on his work. There had been moments during these evenings when Aaron had looked up to find Kenneth watching him with an expression of such focused attention that it had made Aaron's breath catch. Kenneth would smile when their eyes met, but there had been something different about these smiles, something warmer and more intimate than their usual friendly exchanges. Aaron had begun to suspect that Kenneth was working up the courage to say something specific, to cross whatever line he had been approaching in their conversations. But days had turned into weeks without any direct declaration, and Aaron had found himself caught between hope and frustration, wanting to push for clarity but afraid of disrupting the delicate balance they had achieved. The breakthrough had come on a Tuesday evening in late February when Aaron had been struggling with a particularly difficult batch of essays while Kenneth worked on his laptop at the other end of the couch. Aaron had been rubbing his temples, trying to ease the headache that had been building all day, when Kenneth had closed his laptop and moved closer. Kenneth had asked if Aaron wanted him to massage his shoulders, his voice soft and careful in a way that had made Aaron look up in surprise. The offer had felt like more than simple friendly concern, weighted with an intimacy that had made Aaron's heart race even as he nodded his acceptance. Kenneth's hands had been warm and gentle as he worked the tension from Aaron's shoulders, his touch sending electricity through Aaron's body in ways that had made it difficult to concentrate on anything else. Aaron had found himself leaning into the contact, his eyes fluttering closed as Kenneth's fingers found the knots of stress he had been carrying. The massage had lasted longer than necessary, Kenneth's hands moving with increasing confidence as Aaron relaxed under his touch. There had been something almost reverent about the way Kenneth touched him, as if he was exploring new territory that he found both fascinating and meaningful. When Kenneth had finally stopped, his hands had lingered on Aaron's shoulders for a moment before he had pulled away. Aaron had turned to thank him and had found Kenneth watching him with an expression of such intense longing that it had stolen Aaron's breath. They had stared at each other in silence, the air between them crackling with tension that neither seemed willing to break. Aaron had felt like they were standing at the edge of a cliff, one step away from changing everything between them. But Kenneth had eventually looked away and returned to his laptop without saying anything. That night, Aaron had lain awake replaying every moment of Kenneth's touch, the way his hands had felt against Aaron's skin, and the expression in his eyes afterward. Something was building between them, something that felt inevitable, despite Aaron's attempts to maintain realistic expectations about his straight roommate's intentions. The following Thursday, Kenneth had suggested they skip their usual restaurant dinner and cook something together at home instead. Aaron had agreed, though the domestic intimacy of preparing a meal together in their small kitchen had felt almost overwhelmingly significant. They had worked side by side, Kenneth chopping vegetables while Aaron prepared the pasta sauce, their movements coordinated in a way that spoke of growing familiarity and comfort. There had been moments when they had to reach around each other in the confined space, their bodies brushing in ways that sent heat racing through Aaron's veins. Kenneth had opened a bottle of wine while they cooked, and by the time they sat down to eat, the atmosphere had felt charged with a possibility. The conversation had flowed easily, but there had been an undercurrent of tension that made every casual touch feel loaded with meaning. After dinner, they had moved to the couch with the remainder of the wine, settling closer together than usual as they talked about everything and nothing. Kenneth had seemed more relaxed than Aaron had seen him in weeks, the wine and the intimacy of their shared meal having loosened his usual careful control. It was then that Kenneth had begun talking about his dreams again, but this time with more specificity than he had ever shown before. He had described dreams of connection and intimacy that felt more real than any of his waking experiences, dreams that left him feeling like he had discovered something essential about himself that he had been missing. Aaron had listened with growing awareness that Kenneth was working toward something specific, some declaration that would change everything between them. Kenneth's voice had grown softer as he spoke, his words more careful and deliberate, as if he was navigating dangerous territory that required extreme precision. Kenneth had talked about feeling like he had been sleepwalking through his romantic life, going through the motions without ever feeling truly present or engaged. But lately, he had been experiencing moments of clarity that challenged everything he thought he knew about himself and what he wanted. Aaron had found himself leaning closer as Kenneth spoke, drawn by the vulnerability in his roommate's voice and the courage it was taking for him to voice such private thoughts. There had been something in Kenneth's eyes as he talked, a searching quality that seemed to be looking for reassurance or permission. When Kenneth had paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever he wanted to say next, Aaron had reached out instinctively and covered Kenneth's hand with his own. The contact had been electric, sending warmth racing up Aaron's arm and making Kenneth's eyes widen with something that looked like recognition. Kenneth had stared down at their joined hands for a long moment before looking up to meet Aaron's eyes. The expression on his face had been one of wonder and fear combined, as if he was seeing Aaron clearly for the first time and was both thrilled and terrified by what he discovered. Aaron had been about to speak, to offer some word of encouragement or understanding, when Kenneth had moved closer on the couch, closing the distance between them until Aaron could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Kenneth's free hand had come up to cup Aaron's face, his thumb brushing across Aaron's cheekbone with infinite gentleness. The touch had made Aaron's breath catch, his eyes fluttering closed as he leaned into Kenneth's palm. When he had opened his eyes again, Kenneth had been watching him with an expression of such raw longing that it had made Aaron's heart race. Kenneth had whispered Aaron's name then, his voice rough with emotion, and Aaron had seen in his eyes the same desperate hope that had been living in his own chest for months. They had been poised on the edge of something that would change everything. Both of them afraid to move forward, but unable to pull back. It was Kenneth who had finally found the courage to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, as he confessed that he had been thinking about Aaron constantly, that his dreams had been filled with images of intimacy and connection that centered entirely around his quiet, thoughtful roommate. Aaron had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes as Kenneth spoke, the words he had longed to hear finally being offered with such tender vulnerability that it made his chest ache with emotion. Kenneth had continued talking, describing how Aaron's presence had become the center of his world, how every conversation and shared meal had felt more meaningful than any romantic encounter he had ever experienced. When Kenneth had finally asked if Aaron felt anything similar, if the connection between them was something Aaron had noticed too, Aaron had been able to do nothing but nod, his voice caught in his throat by the magnitude of what was happening between them. Kenneth had smiled then, an expression of such pure joy and relief that it had transformed his entire face. And Aaron had realized that they had both been carrying the same secret hope, the same careful longing that neither had dared to voice until this moment. The kiss that followed had been inevitable, a natural culmination of months of growing attraction and emotional intimacy. Kenneth had leaned forward slowly, giving Aaron time to pull away if he wanted to, but Aaron had met him halfway, their lips coming together with a gentleness that quickly deepened into something more urgent and desperate. Aaron had never been kissed with such reverence before, such careful attention to his responses and reactions. Kenneth had kissed him like he was something precious and fragile, something to be treasured rather than conquered. And Aaron had found himself melting into the contact with a relief that bordered on overwhelming. When they had finally broken apart, both breathing heavily, Kenneth had rested his forehead against Aaron's and whispered that he had never felt anything like what he felt when he kissed Aaron. The confession had made Aaron's heart soar, even as tears of relief and joy had slipped down his cheeks. They had talked then, curled together on the couch in a tangle of limbs that felt both new and familiar. Kenneth had described the confusion and fear he had experienced as he recognized his attraction to Aaron, the way it had challenged everything he thought he knew about himself. But he had also talked about the rightness of it, the way being close to Aaron felt like coming home to himself in a way he had never experienced before. Aaron had shared his own journey, the months of careful hope and desperate longing, the way he had fallen in love with Kenneth gradually and then all at once. He had talked about the fear of ruining their friendship, the assumption that his feelings would never be returned, the careful walls he had built around his heart to protect himself from disappointment. Kenneth had listened with the same focused attention he had always given Aaron, but now there was something different in his expression, a tenderness and wonder that spoke of seeing Aaron in an entirely new light. When Aaron had finished speaking, Kenneth had cupped his face again and told him that he was sorry it had taken him so long to understand what had been right in front of him all along. The rest of the evening had been spent in quiet conversation and gentle exploration, learning the texture of each other's skin and the taste of each other's mouths. They had moved slowly, both aware that they were crossing into territory that would change everything about their relationship, but neither wanting to rush something that felt so precious and significant. When they had finally made their way to Kenneth's bedroom, it had felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if they had been moving toward this moment since the day they first met. Kenneth had been gentle and attentive, treating Aaron's body like a map he wanted to memorize. And Aaron had responded with a passion and tenderness that surprised them both. Afterward, they had lain tangled together in Kenneth's bed, talking quietly about what this meant for them and how they wanted to move forward. Kenneth had admitted that he was still scared, still uncertain about navigating this new understanding of himself, but he had also said that he had never been more certain of anything than he was of his feelings for Aaron. Aaron had reassured him that they could take things one day at a time, that there was no pressure to have everything figured out immediately. What mattered was that they had found each other, that they had been brave enough to voice the feelings that had been growing between them for months. As Aaron drifted off to sleep in Kenneth's arms, he had felt a peace and contentment that he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the right person. And the future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and hope. The morning had brought no regrets, only a deeper sense of rightness as they moved around each other in their shared kitchen, preparing breakfast with a new ease and intimacy. Kenneth had been tender and affectionate, stealing kisses while Aaron made coffee and wrapping his arms around Aaron's waist as they waited for their eggs to cook. 3 months later, as Aaron sat on their couch processing Kenneth's confession of love, he marveled at how far they had traveled from that first tentative dinner invitation. Kenneth was still standing in the doorway, waiting for Aaron's response to words that had changed everything between them, and Aaron realized that his silence had stretched too long. Aaron stood slowly, crossing the space between them with deliberate steps, and reached out to cup Kenneth's face in his hands, the same way Kenneth had done that first night they kissed. Kenneth leaned into the touch with a sigh of relief, his eyes fluttering closed as Aaron's thumbs brushed across his cheekbones. When Kenneth opened his eyes again, Aaron smiled and whispered that he loved him too, that he had been in love with him since their very first dinner together, maybe even before that. Kenneth's answering smile was radiant, transforming his entire face with joy and relief. And when Aaron kissed him this time, it tasted like coming home and new beginnings all at once. They were both exactly where they needed to be, Aaron thought, as Kenneth's arms came around him, holding him close in the golden afternoon light of their shared apartment. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard, growing slowly from friendship into something deeper and more meaningful than either person had dared to hope for. And sometimes Aaron realized as Kenneth whispered his name against his lips, the most frightening dares led to the most beautiful discoveries of all.